Good afternoon. Good afternoon. That's better. Today I'd like to talk about before, after, and beyond. Because the room has been almost full to bursting with important and ambitious, although kinda abstract ideas, I want to talk about how design might play potential roles in connecting something that you might find next to a bullet point in a planning report, maybe equity or community or metrics or inclusion, how you might take that and actually connect it to something that you might pass one day walking on the street. Now, the classic before and after mainstay of tourism videos and architectural portfolios can be really exciting, the way it dramatizes the transformative powers of art and design. But it also can be insanely ignorant of how designers and planners have been responsible for producing euphemisms, say, urban renewal, sounds pretty good, that serve as cover stories for the willful destruction of communities. And y'all know something about that here in Pittsburgh. Different than the fast violence of a shooting or a stabbing, this kind of slow, structural violence is written into our landscapes in all kinds of overbearing or also subtle ways. But it's not always obvious. For me, growing up in the far western post-war suburbs of St. Louis, Missouri, I experienced many advantages. But I've come to learn that that background also gave me some real disabilities, although probably I should call them sanctioned ignorance, about things like how the suburb where I grew up became segregated, over 93% registered as white on the census, or how spaces and places in our country are racialized, whether it be a Starbucks in Rittenhouse Square in Philly or my own hometown. So when my partner, Jay Shin, and I named our design and planning firm Hector, which is someone's name, but also means to speak forcefully, even to the point of bullying, it was because we wanted to never forget that whether we like it or not, design and planning aren't always about warm, comfortable feelings. These are hectoring businesses. Now, over the past 120 years, our society has developed some pretty intricate mechanisms for trying to connect the prerogatives of property ownership to the ideals of democratic decision-making, from building codes and zoning laws to things like community design centers, one of the earliest of which you have here in Pittsburgh. And this has created the mechanisms that we use today that we call public participation, community engagement. Although sometimes 120 years into the game, you go to a so-called public hearing and don't see much public there. Or maybe more frequently, you see a meeting that's focused on the understandable aggravation of residents facing overly scripted planning exercises. I got off the plane for the first day in Pittsburgh, and by 10 in the morning, someone had stepped to me and said, "I sure hope you didn't bring any Post-it notes and sticky dots." And so I know there's a tradition of proposing a fifth P, possibility, policy, and today there's been a lot of talk about power. And so I just want to add a slight variation, which is the topic of power evasion, which is not a P in the positive sense, but something that needs to be treated and prevented. I think that words like equity can do really useful work in building shared understandings about where we want to go. But unless we're paying careful attention to the forces that shaped the systems that we're trying to change, we run real risks of our work being short-term and easily undone. So while it's important to talk about who is marginalized, we better also be talking and learning about how and who does the marginalizing. And so today I'd like to talk a little bit about how design, in a modest way, might help us deal with power more openly and in a more manipulable way. And I should say that I think all of us have a lot to learn from two great American traditions. First, that of popular education, represented here on your right by Septima Clark and a Freedom School, and that of community organizing, represented here by the first ever conference, National Conference of Neighborhoods, convened in 1972, that eventually led to radical systemic changes, things like the Community Reinvestment Act. So I'm not going to try to convince you that design and planning are some kind of magical pixie dust to be generously sprinkled by professionals on the public. I'd like you to think of the work that we do as one or two entities in a much broader field of place politics, where all kinds of people are trying to push all kinds of agendas on the places that we share. And I think that if we pay closer attention to this notion of place politics, we can hopefully avoid creativity being a power-evasive cover story, and instead use it to generate and support real, productive deliberation about how we plan, design, and build. So to put a little muscle on some of these bones, I want to share some work in progress, very much so, from all the way on the other side of the state, where a mayor has made some pretty ambitious promises and goals about raising a soda tax and using it to rebuild older parks and recreation centers, not in Center City, but in neighborhoods throughout. This is a park in southeast Philadelphia called Mifflin Square Park. If you know it, it's near the intersection of 6th and Rittner. In about 40 square blocks around the park, you'll find about 13,000 people living in those row house homes that I'm sure you all recognize, shopping on the Ave, which since the 80s has been mainly immigrant-owned businesses, the majority from Cambodia. It's a neighborhood, like we've been discussing today, that has extreme disparities in income, just a couple blocks apart from each other. And this map, which has one dot for every person, color-coded by their census-identified race or ethnicity, shows more established, older African-American, Irish-American, Italian-American communities, and since the mid-70s, increasing number of residents who come as immigrants or refugees from places like Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, more recently Syria, Afghanistan, and Bhutan. And it's also a neighborhood that is seeing what might be the very beginning of a reinvestment wave, the likes of which has not been seen for a long time. Although, according to the Pew Charitable Trust, the neighborhood is not officially gentrified. 3 neighboring neighborhoods are, and so I think y'all in Pittsburgh know what that means. So this park, in a pretty densely populated neighborhood, is an important and lively social hub. But it's also been the place when real social drama plays out, real issues of turf and the racialization of space. The most recent incident of which was after a shooting incident about 3 years ago. A celebrated, if unlicensed, group of food vendors in the aftermath was shut down by the authorities. Now, some of the local organizations have an explicitly anti-racist cultural program that they've put out to try to address some of these issues. So, for example, this is a performance of a group called Hip Hop Heritage that brings together young people of all backgrounds in the neighborhood to share in this cultural legacy of their city. And as you might imagine, there's a long list after 100 years of not much investment of complaints and things that people would like to fix about the park, whether it's not enough room for teens to hang out, not enough legitimate play equipment for the tweens to climb on, enough places to sit, making for kind of foreboding entrances. And sometimes people have taken the design of the park into their own hands, like these people who made their own foot volleyball court, or this volleyball court, which meets their needs, but also creates problems, like on dry days, kicking up huge clouds of dusts that float over to interrupt these elders who have brought their own furniture to play cards in the park. And of course, on rainy days, becoming a mud hole. So I want to suggest 3 almost microscopic ways that not just design, but the design process can really support creating the capacity that we need to be both power evasive and to try to connect some of the grand ambitions we're discussing to the nuts and bolts of getting something done. So the first thing is learning from that tradition of popular education to try to make all of the forces that shape this space somehow visible and accessible to the people who use it. So in the summer of 2016, we were able to work with a group of young people with mural arts and Philly Youth Employment in a summer youth employment project to investigate what does Southeast Philly have to do to get Mifflin Square Park rebuilt how it wants. Starting with brainstorming, surveying the territory, documenting what we found there, just like architecture students, going to the free library to understand the growth of the neighborhood around the park, seeing how its physical look changes and how that connects to a whole set of social meanings, digging out old newspaper articles to really give the lie to people who blame the most recently arrived group for either dirty streets or violence. So these are from 29 and 41. And then taking those historic documents and cutting them up, collaging them, imagining monuments that might really support the spirit of the place. And then coming up with interview questions to go and try to understand how things actually work from the adults who make decisions. So visiting community-based organizations, talking to policy experts, meeting the landscape architects at the Parks Department, and then analyzing it. Teenagers are often much less power evasive than us adults, noticing things like differential treatment of Cambodian American and Italian American street food vendors. Visiting the councilman, everyone was wowed to hear that $3 million might not be a problem, but getting everyone in the neighborhood to agree might really be. And then studying the bureaucracy of the Parks Department, so how orders from the highest echelons of city government may or may not reach the actual parks in the neighborhoods in terms of maintenance and investment. Studying the social organizations in the neighborhood, possibilities for coalition to build power, imagined as this strange kind of Voltron creature. After getting feedback from some of the actual groups, making this drawing that tries to imagine a path from the individuals recorded by the census, through neighborhood organizations, and then becoming the superhero who rebuilds parks with soda tax money. Also studying how parks get rebuilt and how communities have had the best luck weighing in on that process. The students recorded and drew all of the characters and spirits of the park, the good things and the bad things, and made this tribute to Meek Mill, who's now free, called Park Dreams and Nightmares. And then took all these drawings back to the people that we had interviewed and out into the streets to try to spread the circle of people who had some kind of access to these issues, to make the government actually be responsive to what they wanted. And indeed, a coalition got formed that then commissioned us, we were lucky, to make a park and neighborhood plan. And the first thing they said is, we would like to send home a fold-out poster to every school kid at the 7 schools around this park in 8 languages that shares what the students discovered and offers a fleeting, if fun, opportunity to project some kind of vision onto the feet of that park. Cutting and pasting and imagining what this neighborhood might look like if given physical form. So the second way that I think the design process can be useful is in producing the public. Something that we've learned from community organizers is that the public just doesn't exist as a thing out there. It has to be patiently, sometimes painfully assembled by door knocking, flyering, assembling email lists, Facebook groups, monthly meetings. And so in this case, it started with the professional staff of organizations and city agencies, walking the streets, talking to people, understand what's good and what's not so good. Walking through the park, sometimes attracting people who were unknown up to that point, like this gentleman who was a block club president. Taking those observations and recording them in drawings. Setting up an advisory committee, again, for the communication just of the community groups who don't always get along. But then trying to imagine how to reach beyond the professionals to the actual residents. And so we tried to come up with a way that people would be comfortable, able to relate to people as people, to joke around, to share stories, as well as serious ambitions and ideas for what this shared space should be. We went to schools, libraries, out-of-school time programs. They were always hosted, again, by these small organizations who not very often were in a position to do things together, sharing knowledge and memories about this place. Scaled figures that would show how big a volleyball court needed or a soccer field, and these kind of open-ended objects. All kinds of discussions happened about how many seats you need to have a fun card game, whether there should be hills or not in this place. Could the playground somehow more directly reflect the wild cultures of the neighborhood? And most important were the interactions. Like this guy says, my family 2 generations ago came up from North Carolina straight to the big city. And this woman, a Korean woman from Burma, said, that's crazy. That's exactly what happened to me. And so then to reach further and develop another leadership group, we were able to set up a program called Community Design Leaders, where again, these groups work together, not always agreeing, to get nominations and applications for these positions, which were stipended, and began with a day-long workshop on a Saturday with childcare and everything you need to make that work, where we talked about design issues, how the park got rebuilt, kind of recycling and retelling the stories that the young people had dug up. People divided into committees on specific goals, like restoring legal vending in the park or creating more comfortable places to sit. And all these ideas from the public conversations and the design leaders were brought together at a neighborhood convening so people could appreciate or criticize the ideas of others. So the third and final role that I want to suggest where design process may be useful is once you have all these wild dreams and ambitions and ideas, how in the world do you connect that to a process that actually gets something done, that deals with budgets and timelines and political pressures? So we began with some of the most popular ideas, like places to sit, and did interactive design build projects, like a gathering garden, or this thing that was called the super seating, kind of an experimental piece of play equipment, or now an actually licensed shared vending truck. And our analysis showed that a lot of people felt that there wasn't enough room in this park, that it was too divided and fragmented into spaces. And so the idea came up of repacking the suitcase in a little bit more efficient way. But this required actually talking to these different groups of users in the park and trying to come up with a consensus that they would agree to move what they were doing to a different place to make the park more usable. So the volleyball players, the soccer players, the dudes who are always at this table. We began to make drawings trying to show what these things might begin to look like, developing various design directions with these suggestion seats in 7 languages where you could write or you could just circle and cross out. And these were used in these public design focus groups where people who had separately met with their own organizations came together, again, to talk about what could be acceptable to all. Older and younger people talking together, and situations which were rare in my experience of an Asian American, an African American, and a person who's come to be known as white actually talking about the power dynamics of the park. So we just released this concept plan, but of course, the work's not done. I told you early that it was gonna be before, after, and beyond. So now we're building support for the park, trying to raise the financing, and developing these kinds of design details. And though I can't say what it's gonna look like in a neat before and after, I can definitely say that this kind of work, microscopic as it may be, as different as it may be than grand plans and visions, is the necessary connective social power for any of these things to achieve the kind of goals that we are talking about today. And I think we have to think about what does this look like not just for one project or 2 projects or 3 projects, the way that the community design field has operated, but what does it look like on a citywide basis? What kind of staffing, pipeline, spaces, and resources are necessary so we can treat design as the shared creation of meaning and value and get the neighborhoods and cities that we want. Thank you very much.